The phone rang at a strange hour, that liminal space between dusk and true night, when shadows blur and silence feels heavier than it should. I had just settled with a book, an old copy of Milton. I'd taught 100 times when the shrill sound cut through the room. My hands trembled as I reached for it. "Mrs. Hightower." A man's voice asked, clipped and urgent. "This is St. Mary's Regional Hospital. Your son Dorian has been admitted following a serious accident. He's in surgery now. You need to come immediately." The words rearranged my world in an instant. I didn't ask questions, I only heard accident surgery and come immediately. I pulled on my coat, left the lights burning in the house, and drove through the empty streets as if the darkness itself were pushing me forward. The hospital's fluorescent lobby hit me like an interrogation lamp. At the ICU desk, a young receptionist asked my name, her voice flat, with practiced detachment. "You'll need to wait, ma'am. He's in emergency neurosurgery." I gripped the counter. "My son, please, I need to see him." A surgeon in green scrubs appeared, face shadowed with fatigue. "Mrs. Hightower?" he asked. I nodded, unable to find my voice. "Your son is in critical condition. Severe head trauma swelling around the brain. We're doing everything we can, but the next 24 hours will be decisive." He spoke clinically, but I heard the undercurrent. They didn't know if he would make it. They let me wait outside ICU room 407, the glass wall separating me from machines that hissed and beeped with mechanical indifference. I pressed my palm to the glass, whispering Dorian's name, as if sound could bridge the sterile divide. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator, but his stillness chilled me more than the cold tile beneath my shoes. Something gnawed at me. Where was Celine? His wife should have been here, clinging to him, demanding updates, praying beside me. Instead, the chair across the hall sat empty. My mind spun back to last week, when Dorian mentioned casually that Celine had insisted he take the car to a friend's garage she trusted. He'd laughed at my raised eyebrow, said she was particular about things. Now the doctor had explained the brakes had failed completely, like they'd been sliced. The memory landed differently. A friend's shop. A sudden accident. Brakes cut clean. I closed my eyes and pressed my hand against the window once more. "Stay with me, son," I whispered. "Don't let go." The monitor beeped steadily, indifferent, yet faithful, reminding me that he was still here, still fighting. But the absence of his wife wrapped the room in a louder silence than any machine could. An orderly walked by, nodding politely. I nodded back, though my body felt anchored to the floor. My mind replayed every detail of the call. The surgeon's words, the brakes that didn't just fail, but seemed deliberately severed. I sat heavily in the plastic chair, clutching my purse as if it could keep me grounded. A phrase from my teaching days surfaced unbidden. "Hell is truth seen too late." Milton again haunting me in this sterile corridor. Celine's absence was not an oversight. It was a statement. As the night deepened, I realized this wasn't only about whether my son would live through surgery. Something darker had already taken root, and it was waiting for me inside the pages of his medical file, in the signatures on forms I hadn't yet seen, in the cold, deliberate silence of the woman who should have been here. The beeping of the monitors carried me into the long hours ahead, hours that would bleed into discoveries I could never unlearn. By dawn, the corridors had quieted, that in-between hour when even a hospital seems to hold its breath. Officially, visiting hours hadn't begun, but official hours had never stopped, a determined mother. I waited until the night orderly turned the corner, then slipped past the nurse's station and down the hall toward room 407. My heart pounded harder with each step, but I kept moving. Inside, the steady rhythm of machines greeted me. The hiss of the ventilator, the soft blip of the monitors. It was a language of survival I was learning too quickly. Dorian lay so still beneath the thin hospital blanket that for a moment I had to look twice to reassure myself his chest was rising. Tubes snaked around him, IV lines taped to his bruised arm. I moved closer and saw his wedding band glint faintly beneath the harsh fluorescent light. The inscription was there, tiny and precise forever. My fingers lingered above it, aching to touch, but afraid to disturb him. That single word mocked me now. Forever yet, Celine hadn't even darkened the door of the ICU. I bent over him, brushing a strand of hair back from his forehead the way I had when he was a boy. His skin was warm but unresponsive. I whispered his name, willing some part of him to hear me. The door creaked open, and I turned quickly, expecting security. Instead, a woman in pale blue scrubs entered, carrying a clipboard. Her badge read, Isabel Marquez, RN. The fine lines around her eyes spoke of decades in these wards. Mrs. Hightower, she asked softly, closing the door behind her. Yes. My voice was steadier than I felt. She hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering her voice. I shouldn't say this, but there's something you need to know. Something in the paperwork. Her fingers trembled against the clipboard, and I could see her wrestling with her conscience. 30 years of service badges, pinned neatly to her uniform. Nurses like her had seen everything, carried burdens that families rarely glimpsed. What paperwork? I asked, moving closer. She swallowed hard. I'll show you when it's safer. Just be careful who you trust. My grip tightened around the rosary I'd carried in my coat pocket, the same one I'd held when my husband passed. Each bead pressed into my palm like a silent vow. I would not be frightened off. Not now, not with my son lying helpless. I looked back at Dorian, his hand slack against the sheets. I slipped my fingers around his, whispering again that I was here, that he wasn't alone. The monitor responded with a faint uptick in rhythm, a blip that almost sounded like recognition. My throat tightened, tears threatening to spill, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. Isabel touched my arm gently, then slipped out as quietly as she had entered. I remained at Dorian's bedside, clutching his hand in one palm and my rosary in the other. Whatever secret lived in those files, whatever shadow hung over this room, I would drag it into the light. And I knew the first place to start was the mysterious paperwork the nurse had just promised to reveal. I sat by Dorian's bed as the morning light filtered through the narrow blinds, striping his face in harsh bands of white. The machines hummed steadily, indifferent to the storm inside me. I whispered his name every so often, as if repetition might tether him. Here, keep him from slipping into whatever darkness hovered just beyond reach. My phone buzzed on the chair beside me. The screen lit up with a message from an old neighbor, Margot. Marcella, I don't know how to tell you this, but you need to see it. Attached were screenshots, the kind that froze my blood before I even opened them. I enlarged the first photo. Celine, my son's wife, perched on the deck of a gleaming yacht at Marina del Rey. The Pacific shimmered behind her, the horizon awash in sunset gold. She wore a silk wrap, her hair loose in the wind, her glass of champagne raised high. At her side leaned a man I didn't recognize, tall with mirrored sunglasses that reflected nothing but the endless water. His hand rested too comfortably on her waist. I swiped to the next photo. Celine laughing, head tilted back, mouth wide, while the stranger poured more champagne into her glass. Behind them, the yacht's nameplate glinted, Elysium's Dream. The caption read, "To New Beginnings." I felt as if the floor of the ICU shifted under me. My son lay connected to a ventilator. His skull opened hours earlier by surgeons fighting to reduce swelling, while his wife toasted new beginnings with another man. The next image sealed it. The yacht's slip number was visible, a small placard at the dock 47. The invoice Margot had included showed the charter fee $62,000 for the weekend. My hands trembled, rage competing with disbelief. How many times had Celine told me they couldn't afford a bigger apartment, or that Dorian's trust fund had to stay untouched for emergencies? This yacht was no emergency. It was betrayal carved in champagne bubbles and silk. I turned my gaze back to the monitor above Dorian's bed. Each pulse of green light felt like a heartbeat echoing my anger. I wanted to shield him from it, from her. How long had she been planning this? How long had she been erasing him from her future? Even as she smiled at him across dinner tables and kissed his cheek before work. The ICU door opened briefly as a nurse came in to adjust the IV. She offered me a tired smile, one of those professional gestures that carried no real comfort. I nodded, hiding the phone in my lap. I wasn't ready to share this, not yet. Evidence this damning needed to be handled carefully, not flung in the air like gossip. When the nurse left, I leaned closer to Dorian. "She's not here, son," I whispered. "She's never really been here." His chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity. But in my mind, I saw him as a boy again, running across the yard with scraped knees, calling my name with unshakable trust. That boy deserved loyalty. The man he became deserved love, not this mockery of marriage. I closed the photos but couldn't erase the images burned into me. Celine radiant and carefree, celebrating while my son lay broken. To new beginnings. I repeated the phrase under my breath, the words tasting like poison. Something more than grief took root in me then. A cold determination, sharper than any grief I had known when I lost my husband. This wasn't just tragedy. This was treachery, and treachery demanded answers. I slipped the phone back into my purse, reached for my rosary, and wrapped it tight around my fingers. Celine thought she was free, laughing on the water. She had no idea I had already begun pulling on the first thread of her unraveling. The monitor beeped steadily beside me, a reminder that my son was still alive, still worth fighting for. And I knew the next step was to uncover exactly what else Celine had signed in his name. The images of Celine on the yacht clung to me like smoke, poisoning every thought. I couldn't push them away. When the ICU hall quieted again, Nurse Isabel appeared, her eyes darting toward the cameras mounted above the doors. She motioned for me to follow her. We slipped into a supply closet, dim and crowded with rolling carts of linens. She shut the door and pressed her back against it, as though bracing against an invisible weight. From the pocket of her scrubs, she pulled out a folded sheet of paper and handed it to me. "I shouldn't have this," she whispered, "but you need to see it." My fingers hesitated, then unfolded the paper. The words swam before me. "Do not resuscitate order." Dorian's name typed at the top. My breath caught. At the bottom, the signature. It was neat, deliberate, almost elegant. Dorian had never signed anything that way in his life. His handwriting was a hurried scrawl, a professor's nightmare, jagged and uneven. This wasn't him. I looked up sharply at Isabel. "This is forged." She nodded, her jaw set tight. "The timestamp shows it was filed yesterday, 3rd 17 p.m. I thought back instantly to Margot's screenshots. At 3:17 p.m., Celine had been on that yacht. I had the proof in my phone: champagne glass, raised slip number, visible laughter frozen in the golden light. She wasn't even near the hospital when this document was supposedly signed. The weight of it pressed on me. This wasn't neglect or cruelty. This was design. Celine wasn't just waiting for my son to die. She was maneuvering to make sure he did. Isabel lowered her voice further. "Hospital policy requires 2 physician signatures for any DNR. This has one." And the attending never signed off. I clutched the paper, my hands shaking. I imagined Celine leaning over the counter at admissions, her voice smooth, her smile polished. I had underestimated her. She wasn't careless. She was calculating. Isabel touched my arm. I could lose my job if anyone knows I gave this to you. You've given me my son's life, I said, forcing my voice to steady. That's worth more than any job. Her eyes softened, but fear still shadowed her face. She slipped out first, leaving me with the damning paper in my hands. I pressed it to my chest for a moment, then folded it carefully into my purse alongside my rosary. When I returned to room 407, Dorian's monitors blinked calmly as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I sat beside him, staring at his bandaged head, his still hand. The forged DNR lay heavy in my purse, a silent weapon I hadn't chosen, but now carried. I thought of Celine again, her silk wrap, her champagne smile. How many people had already been deceived by her charm? How many had already signed or stamped documents because she asked, because she batted her eyes, because she told them it was for family? The rosary beads pressed into my palm, grounding me. My husband used to tell me truth always had a paper trail. Maybe that's why I had married a lawyer and later raised a son who lived by evidence and logic. Now that truth was staring me down in the form of this single forged page. I leaned closer to Dorian. They think I'm old that I won't notice, but I notice. I promise you I will not let her decide when you leave this world. The machines answered with their steady rhythm. I sat through the long hours watching the sun rise higher, bathing the blinds in sterile light. And as the hallway stirred with new shifts and fresh scrubs, I knew this forged signature was only the beginning. If Celine had stolen his right to breathe, then what else had she already taken? By the next morning, I had memorized the pattern of Dorian's monitors, each blink and hum, like a language I alone could read. I had drifted in and out of uneasy sleep in the chair by his bed, my rosary still tangled in my hand. When the clock over the nurse's station struck 8, a security guard approached. Mrs. Hightower. His voice was practiced, polite. I'm going to need you to step out. I rose slowly, thinking perhaps the doctors needed space. Of course, but I'll be right back in. He shifted uncomfortably. I'm sorry, ma'am. You won't be allowed back into the ICU. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. What do you mean I'm his mother? Orders from Mrs. Pierce, he said firmly. Family access has been restricted. Effective immediately. The words slammed into me harder than any physical shove. I stared past him at my son, still motionless under the sterile light. My voice cracked. That woman hasn't visited him once, and now she bars me. The guard avoided my eyes, but his orders were clear. He guided me into the hall, where a woman in a gray blazer waited with a clipboard. She introduced herself as a representative from social services. Mrs. Hightower, we've received a petition raising concerns about your cognitive capacity, she said. Her tone was cool, bureaucratic. Claims of early-stage dementia. Until this is evaluated, your access to medical decisions will be limited. For a long moment, I simply blinked at her. Dementia. Who said that? She glanced down at her file. Statement was filed by Mrs. Celine Pierce. The humiliation burned hot in my cheeks, spreading like wildfire through my chest. I was 68, yes, and my knees ached in the morning, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. Just last month, I'd taken a full cognitive assessment at Dr. Patel's office. Perfect scores. Every column checked clean. I had proof in a folder at home. Do you mean to tell me? I said slowly that while my son lies in surgery, his wife is accusing me of senility. The woman with the clipboard shifted uncomfortable, but said nothing. Her silence was its own confirmation. I walked out of the ICU on unsteady legs, but the weakness wasn't age, it was rage. In the waiting room, I sat heavily, pulling my rosary from my purse and clutching it so tightly the beads dug into my skin. The sting steadied me. This was no longer just about Celine's absence or the forged DNR. This was strategy. She wanted me silenced, discredited, locked out. She wanted to make sure no one stood between her and the fortune she thought she could claim. I closed my eyes and saw again her laughing face on the yacht, the stranger's mirrored sunglasses, the words, "To new beginnings." She was not grieving. She was preparing to step into a new life funded by my son's death. But she had made a critical mistake. She underestimated me. She thought labeling me old and unfit would end the fight before it began. She didn't know I had records witnesses and a lifetime of discipline carved into me from years of teaching grading, proving truth line by line. I sat straighter, opened my notebook and began to write everything down, the time the words, the guard used, the representative's phrasing, the exact language about dementia. Every detail mattered. If Celine wanted to turn this into a war of documents, I was ready. And as I wrote, one truth settled deeper than all the others. If she was desperate enough to paint me as senile, it meant she had much more to hide. By the time evening draped itself over the hospital, I had made up my mind. If Celine thought she could bar me with forms and accusations, she had forgotten who raised Dorian. I hadn't spent decades navigating classrooms full of restless students just to be silenced by a forged document. The front entrance was swarming with staff too visible. But I had noticed earlier that the West Wing service door clicked open for delivery carts. At 9 o'clock, sharp, I followed a custodian carrying a bin of linens and slipped quietly inside. My heart hammered as though I were committing a crime, yet every beat told me this trespass was righteous. The ICU corridor was hushed, the kind of silence that presses on the chest. I counted the doors until I reached 407. For a moment, I feared an alarm would sound when I turned the handle, but it opened without resistance. The room was dim, lit only by the steady glow of monitors. Dorian lay as I had left him, still pale, tethered by tubes and wires. My breath caught in my throat, but I moved to his side. I slid my hand into his, cold at first, then warmer as I held it close. "You're not alone," I whispered. Leaning so near, my lips brushed the edge of his ear. "Not while I have breath." The monitor beeped steadily, then ticked higher just a fraction. But enough. My heart surged. It wasn't random. It couldn't be. Somewhere inside that fragile body, my son had heard me. Tears blurred my vision. I tightened my grip. "Dorian, I'm here. And I promise you I won't let her win. Whatever Celine has planned, she'll have to walk through me first." I sat, rosary curled in my free hand, and let memories steady me. The first time Dorian pedaled a bike without training wheels, how he skinned his knees but refused to cry. The way he held Lucienne the day she was born, astonished and trembling, whispering my little star into her blanket. He was a fighter. He had always been a fighter. "I'll protect her too," I murmured. "Lucienne deserves a future free from lies. She deserves to grow up with love, not greed." The faint blip on the monitor steadied again, almost as if in agreement. I let out a shuddering breath. My son was buried deep beneath swelling and sedation, but somewhere he was still trying. I had to believe that. The hours passed, quietly punctuated only by the machine's rhythm. I whispered prayers half to God and half to Dorian himself. My body ached from the hard chair, but I didn't loosen my grip. If touch and presence could anchor him, then I would anchor him until the end of time. At last I rose, kissing his forehead lightly, and tucked the blanket closer around his arm. "Sleep, son," I said softly. "I'll keep watch." When I slipped back into the corridor, I carried the weight of both my vow and that faint spike on the monitor. Celine thought she was erasing him. She didn't know that even in silence he was answering me. And if he was still fighting, then I had no choice but to fight harder. The next morning, I called Colleen Drayton. We had known each other for years. She'd been one of my brightest students before becoming an attorney, with a reputation for uncovering what others wanted buried. I told her enough to make her lower her voice and say, "Bring every scrap of paper you have, Marcella. Meet me at my office in an hour." Colleen's office overlooked a quiet corner of downtown bookshelves, lined with case files, and a faint scent of coffee always lingering in the air. She listened carefully as I explained what I had found. Celine's absence, the yacht, the forged DNR. I slid the photocopy of the order across her desk. Colleen's sharp eyes scanned it, then flicked up to mine. "This is criminal," she said flatly. "If it holds up, she's setting herself up for more than fraud. But let's start with property and financials. That's where people like her usually get sloppy." She pulled her laptop closer and began typing with practiced speed, navigating county property records. My stomach knotted as her expression tightened. "Here it is," she murmured. "Dorian and Celine's condo, originally joint ownership. But last month the deed was amended." She turned the screen toward me. My son's name had vanished. Only Celine's remained. I felt the air leave my lungs. She didn't tell him. "Look at the signature," Colleen said, clicking to open the authorization page. The scrawl labeled Dorian Hightower was a ghost of his real handwriting, controlled, tidy, deliberate. I thought of the forged DNR, the same unnatural neatness. "She forged it," I whispered. Colleen nodded grimly. "And no notary's stamp. Which means she leaned on someone inside the clerk's office or falsified the filing. Either way, she was confident no one would notice. I pressed my hand to my chest, trying to steady the thud of my heart. This wasn't just betrayal in theory. She was carving his life away, piece by piece, legally erasing him, while he still fought for breath. Colleen wasn't finished. She pulled out a folder of bank statements, the kind attorneys knew how to request quickly. Joint checking savings, even his trust-linked account. "See these withdrawals, always under 10,000, always in neat intervals. Total, over the last 6 months, 310,000. I stared at the rows of numbers. To anyone else, they might have looked like ordinary expenses, transfers, card charges, checks, written for ambiguous household needs. But strung together, they told a story of theft disguised as routine. "She thought she was clever," Colleen said, tapping the page, keeping it below reporting thresholds. "But clever isn't careful enough when someone's watching." I closed my eyes, picturing Celine's smile the way she used to stand beside Dorian at family gatherings, her hand tucked into his arm, like she belonged there. All the while, she had been draining him dry, planning for a future that didn't include him. Colleen reached across the desk, placing her hand lightly over mine. "You're not imagining this, Marcella. The paper trail doesn't lie. She's been planning for months, maybe longer." I swallowed hard, forcing down the bitterness that rose in my throat. It wasn't just the money or the condo. It was the certainty that she had built an entire scheme brick by brick while smiling in our faces. "I need copies of everything," I said. Finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "You'll have them today," Colleen promised. When I stepped back into the sunlight, the folder clutched against my chest. The world felt altered. Celine wasn't just absent or cruel or careless. She was deliberate. And if she had stolen his home and his accounts, then somewhere out there was the next page of her ledger, the one that explained exactly how she meant to erase the rest of him. I tightened my grip on the folder and turned toward the hospital, knowing I had to return to room 407 with more than prayers. I carried Colleen's folder home like it was evidence in a trial, because that's exactly what it was. The condo transfer, the withdrawals, the forged signature, they were nails in a coffin. Celine was building long before Dorian's accident. But part of me knew there was more, and I would only find it where my husband used to keep everything safe. Our study hadn't changed since he passed. The oak desk still smelled faintly of tobacco, though he had quit years before. The top drawer slid open easily, but it was the bottom left one. I wanted the one with the brass lock. I hadn't opened it in years, but the small key hung on a chain with his wedding ring in my jewelry box. I pressed the cool metal into the lock, and with a reluctant click, the drawer gave way. Inside lay a manila folder, thick and weighty. My husband had labeled it in his precise handwriting, for Dorian. My chest tightened as I pulled it out, brushing away a thin film of dust. I sat down at the desk, the rosary beads still warm in my pocket, and opened the folder. The first pages were official documents, the trust fund my husband had left for Dorian, a careful estate meant to secure his future and Lucienne's after him. Investments, accounts, property holdings, all meticulously cataloged. I had forgotten how much my husband had prepared, how carefully he had planned for stability. But then I found something that stopped me cold. Folded between the legal pages was a sheet of lined paper torn from a notepad. Dorian's handwriting, messy, hurried, familiar, filled the lines. Call attorney. Ask about divorce. I traced the words with my fingertips, as if touching them could summon him back. My son had been planning to leave Celine. He had seen through her charm, her ambition, her hunger for what wasn't hers. My throat closed. All those months when he had seemed distracted, tired, his eyes clouded, when Celine wasn't watching, he had been carrying this weight. And he had confided it nowhere but in this folded note tucked into a folder his father once guarded. I leaned back in the chair, the paper trembling in my hands. If he had been ready to take that step, did Celine find out? Did she know her golden ladder to wealth was about to collapse beneath her? The thought turned my stomach. The brakes cut clean the forged DNR, the condo transfer. The drained accounts, it all wove together into a chilling pattern. Divorce would have left her with nothing but embarrassment, but widowhood with insurance and property. That was her true plan. I closed my eyes, remembering the way Dorian had smiled at Lucienne, how gentle his hand was when he tucked her hair behind her ear. He wouldn't have stayed in a loveless marriage for appearances. He had been ready to protect his daughter from Celine's poison. The folder lay open before me, its contents like a map of betrayal and survival. Trust funds meant for the future. Divorce notes that never had the chance to be spoken aloud. My husband's legacy. My son's silent cry, all pressed into paper that now became a weapon. I gathered everything, slipping it back into the folder and locking the drawer again. The key went into my pocket beside the rosary. Evidence, faith, memory, they were all I had left to hold. When I rose from the chair, my legs ached, but my resolve was sharper than ever. If Celine had already stripped Dorian of his home and his savings, and if she had discovered his plans to leave her, then this accident was no accident at all. I turned off the light in the study and walked back into the hall. The folder clutched against my chest. Tomorrow I would return to the hospital, not just as a grieving mother, but as a guardian, armed with proof. When I returned to the hospital the following afternoon, Isabel was waiting for me near the vending machines, her eyes darting as if every passerby might be listening. She motioned me to sit on the worn plastic chairs tucked in the corner, out of view of the main hall. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She's been calling the insurance company. Every day, sometimes twice. Always asking about the same thing, the death benefit payout. I felt my pulse hammer in my throat. How much? Isabel glanced around again, then leaned closer. 2.3 million. And she's asking about the timelines, the required documents. Like she's studying for an exam. The number knocked the breath out of me. 2.3 million. I remembered the night Dorian had told me about the policy. We had been sitting in my kitchen, Lucienne, asleep in the next room. Celine had insisted, he explained, her voice echoing through his words. We need to think about our future. If anything happens, you want me and Lucienne taken care of, don't you? At the time, I had thought it was prudent, if a bit excessive for a young couple. But now I saw the glint of manipulation behind it. The policy hadn't been for security, it had been an investment, one she was preparing to cash in. "There's more?" Isabel said, her fingers tightening around her badge lanyard. "The policy has a double indemnity clause. Accidental death doubles the payout. That would mean 4.6 million. The words sank like lead. I thought of the brakes cut clean, the so-called accident that landed Dorian in this bed. An accident that multiplied Celine's jackpot. I pressed my hand over my mouth, fighting the bile rising in my throat. Every piece fit too neatly: the forged DNR, the condo transfer, the drained accounts, now the insurance calls. She wasn't waiting for fate. She was orchestrating it. I looked through the glass panel of room 407. My son lay tethered to machines, his life suspended in wires and beeps. He had always trusted too easily, wanted to see the best in people, even in Celine. He hadn't seen that she wasn't building a life with him. She was building a fortune on his grave. Isabel touched my arm gently. "I thought you should know. We hear more than people realize. Thin walls in consultation rooms. And she's not careful." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Gratitude and fury churned inside me, twisting into a cold determination. "Thank you," I managed at last. "You may have saved us all." She squeezed my hand quickly before hurrying off, leaving me alone with the weight of her revelation. I pulled the rosary from my pocket, the beads warm now from constant use. I threaded them through my fingers, each one grounding me in the truth. 2.3 million for his life. 4.6 if it looked like an accident. Celine hadn't just betrayed her vows, she had commodified. My son turned him into numbers on a balance sheet. I rose from the chair and walked back into the ICU. The monitors greeted me again, steady and impartial. I sat at Dorian's bedside, taking his hand. "She thinks she's written your ending," I whispered. "But she hasn't met the full strength of your mother yet." The faint rhythm of the machines answered, as if echoing my vow. I straightened, staring at the shadows lengthening across the room, and felt the fury crystallize into resolve. If Celine thought a severed brake line would double her winnings, then she had miscalculated, because I wasn't going to let her collect. Late that night, when the hospital finally settled into its fragile hush, I sat with my phone glowing in my lap. Margot had sent more screenshots, each one a dagger. This time, the photos weren't just Celine toasting with champagne, they were intimate, damning. She wore a red silk dress that clung to her like flame. Her arm looped possessively around a man I didn't recognize at first. He was younger than Dorian, maybe early 40s, with hair too carefully styled and a smile that belonged more to a mirror than to a camera. His name appeared in the caption tags, Cassian Holt. A cosmetic clinic manager, Margot had explained, one of those men who built fortunes catering to vanity. The timestamp on the photos froze me. They had been posted at 4:12 p.m., the very moment Dorian's skull was under a surgeon's saw, while I sat clutching my rosary in a sterile waiting room, praying my son would live. At that precise hour, Celine was draped in scarlet silk, laughing against another man's shoulder, her glass of champagne catching the sunset like liquid fire. I stared at the image until my vision blurred. Betrayal layered on betrayal. It wasn't enough that she had drained his accounts, stolen his home, and plotted for insurance money. She had also abandoned him in his most desperate hour, her vows discarded as easily as the cork from that champagne bottle. Cassian's hand rested firmly on her hip, too intimate for chance. The look in his eyes wasn't casual. It was ownership, the smug pride of a man who believed he'd already won. The nurse on duty adjusted Dorian's monitors, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I turned the phone face down on my lap, but the images burned behind my eyes. Dorian had always been loyal to a fault, steady and true. And this was the return. He got scarlet laughter on a yacht while his brain swelled under surgical lights. I lifted his hand carefully from the blanket, holding it between mine. His fingers were slack, but I whispered anyway. She's not worthy of you. Not of your love, not of your trust, not of this life you fight for. The monitor beeped in steady rhythm, unconcerned, but I thought I saw the faintest flicker in the line as though he heard. Perhaps that was wishful thinking. Still, it steadied me. Cassian Holt. The name repeated in my mind like an indictment. Why would a clinic manager risk his career, his reputation, to stand beside Celine in this theater of greed? What promise had she made him? What fortune had she dangled before his eyes? I tucked the phone back into my purse, careful with the folder of documents inside. Property transfers, withdrawals, insurance calls, and now, photographs time-stamped to the hour of betrayal. Every piece was a thread, and together they were beginning to weave a net strong enough to catch them both. I leaned closer to my son, whispering into the quiet. "Hold on, Dorian. I'll make sure the truth is louder than her laughter." The words felt like a vow etched into the silence, one I would not break, no matter what came next. After staring at the photos of Celine and Cassian until I could no longer bear their smug smiles, I knew prayer and paperwork alone wouldn't be enough. I needed someone who could dig into shadows deeper than I could reach. That's when I remembered Jonas Calloway. Years ago, he'd helped a friend of mine trace a husband's hidden accounts during a brutal divorce. An ex-FBI fraud specialist, Jonas had the kind of gaze that made liars twitch. He'd left the bureau after a scandal he wasn't part of, but couldn't stomach. And since then, he'd made a name uncovering what wealthy pretenders wanted to hide. I called him from the hospital's parking lot, my voice tight with exhaustion. He answered on the second ring, gravel low in his throat. "Marcella Hightower. Didn't expect to hear from you. What trouble has found you? My son is in a coma. His wife has forged documents, stolen his accounts, and she's celebrating with another man while he fights for his life. I need proof strong enough to bury her in her own lies." Silence stretched then. "This is bigger than adultery." "Much bigger," I said. His fee was steep, $20,000 up front, but I didn't hesitate. I wired it that evening using a portion of my retirement savings. Dorian's life was worth more than any nest egg. Jonas met me the next morning at a diner off Ventura Boulevard. He was broad-shouldered, his hair silver, but his posture sharp. He slid into the booth across from me with a leather notebook and a laptop. "You brought me a mess," he said, not unkindly. "Let's see how deep it runs." I passed him copies of the forged DNR, the condo transfer, the bank statements Colleen had pulled. He leafed through them, expressionless. Then he opened his laptop, fingers moving quickly. Within minutes, he had accessed financial databases I didn't even know existed. "Here we go," he murmured. "Cayman Islands. An account under Celine's maiden name. Deposits every 2 weeks, roughly 5,000 to 8,000. That lines up with the withdrawals from your son's accounts. Classic laundering." He clicked again, bringing up scanned receipts. Jewelry purchases from Cartier and Harry Winston dinners at Le Bernardin in New York Hotel, stays in Miami and Cabo. Every expense screamed excess, and everyone matched the exact pattern of missing funds from Dorian's accounts. I felt my stomach twist as Jonas read aloud. $18,000 watch, $22,000 diamond bracelet, $62,000 yacht charter. He looked up at me. "She's not hiding the lifestyle. She's hiding the source." I pressed my hands together on the table to keep them from trembling. My son's money, his trust, his future. Lucienne's inheritance poured into champagne silk and lies. Jonas leaned back, folding his arms. "This is methodical, not a one-off splurge. She's been siphoning funds for at least 6 months, maybe longer. Always small enough to avoid alerts, but steady enough to build her private fortune offshore." I stared out the window, watching cars crawl down the boulevard, their drivers oblivious to the storm inside me. Every number Jonas listed was another nail in the coffin of the woman who called herself my daughter-in-law. "She thinks she's clever," I whispered. "She's sloppy," Jonas corrected. "Sloppy people get caught. And when they get caught, they take down anyone standing too close. That man in the yacht photos, he's standing very close." I nodded, slowly. My rosary pressed against my chest from my pocket, its beads warm like a pulse. The documents, the photos, the accounts, all of it was converging into a truth that couldn't be denied. Jonas closed his laptop with a decisive snap. "This isn't just greed, this is fraud on a federal scale. And if she's forged medical documents too, that makes it criminal neglect, at best, attempted homicide, at worst." I rose from the booth, gripping the folder of evidence tighter. Every step forward revealed more rot than I had dared imagine. And still, I sensed we hadn't reached the bottom. When I returned to the hospital that evening, I walked into room 407 with Jonas's words echoing in my head, and I knew the next revelation would be darker still. The hospital never truly sleeps. Its walls hum with machines and hushed voices. But at 2 a.m, the ICU feels like a church stripped of its parishioners, still heavy waiting. I had dozed in the waiting room when Nurse Drusilla Vaughn approached, her face pale and tight. "Mrs. Hightower," she said softly, "we need to talk." Her hands were trembling as she pulled me aside. Drusilla had 20 years in critical care, a reputation for calm under pressure. Seeing her rattled froze my blood. "She came here," Drusilla whispered. "Celine?" At 2:03 a.m. she used her badge to slip past the security desk. "I thought it was strange she hasn't visited your son once in daylight." I followed. My throat tightened. "What did you see?" Drusilla glanced around, making sure no one lingered. "She was at your son's bedside with a syringe. No label, no chart order." I stopped her before she could inject it. The floor seemed to tilt under me. "What happened to the syringe Drusilla's jaw set?" "I secured it according to protocol. It's already at the lab." The hours that followed blurred until the call came. Lab results confirmed potassium chloride mixed with insulin, potent enough to stop a heart in minutes, disguised to mimic diabetic shock. Fatal, quick, and almost undetectable. I sat gripping the arms of my chair until my knuckles ached, staring at the sterile floor tiles. It wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't suspicion or paperwork. It was proof. Celine had tried to murder my son. Drusilla returned later, slipping into the waiting area with the weariness of someone carrying a burden too heavy. The report's been logged. It's official. Potassium chloride and insulin. She lowered her voice. "You need to understand what this means. If I hadn't stopped her, she didn't finish. She didn't have to." My rosary pressed against my palm, the beads sharp with each desperate squeeze. I whispered a prayer not just for Dorian's life, but for the strength to face what came next. I thought of Lucienne, her sweet laugh, her small hand tucked in mine. If Celine could stand over her husband's hospital bed with poison in hand, what would stop her from doing worse to secure her fortune? I looked through the ICU glass at my son. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of the ventilator. He was still fighting even as his wife plotted his death. I wanted to burst into that room and shield him with my body. Instead, I forced myself to breathe and think. Celine wasn't reckless. Every move had been calculated, the forged DNR, the drained accounts, the insurance calls, now the syringe. She wanted Dorian gone, and the money in her grasp tied up neatly with no suspicion. But she hadn't counted on witnesses, on Isabel, on Drusilla, on me. I rose from the chair, my body stiff, but my resolve iron. "Thank you," I told Drusilla. "You saved his life tonight." She nodded, her eyes damp. I couldn't let her do it. Not on my watch. When she left, I pressed my forehead to the cool glass of Dorian's door. "You're not leaving me," I whispered. "Not like this." Not to her. The machines answered with steady beeps, their quiet song of resistance. I gathered my purse, the folder of evidence inside, heavier than ever. Celine had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and I knew the next step wasn't prayer alone, it was action. And I was prepared to act before she finished what she had started. The parking garage beneath St. Catherine's was a cavern of shadows and echoes. At night, its fluorescent bulbs hummed faintly, casting pale light over rows of concrete and metal. I had been waiting near the stairwell for nearly an hour, my pulse steady, despite the storm inside me. When Celine's red heels finally clicked against the cement, I stepped forward. She froze at the sight of me, then tried to compose herself, adjusting the strap of her leather bag. "What are you doing here, Marcella?" she asked, her voice all feigned poise. I held up a small folder, its edges worn from my grip. "Making sure you don't walk away with more than you already have." Her eyes flickered just for a second before she laughed, a sharp sound that echoed through the garage. "You're trespassing. Security won't like this." I stepped closer into the cone of weak light between us. "I have yacht photos time-stamped to the very hour Dorian's brain surgery began. You were in silk and champagne while he was under the knife." I let the words hang in the air. The smile faltered. "And I have the DNR you forged," I continued, my tone even deliberate. "Your neat little signature masquerading as his messy scrawl, filed when you weren't even on land." Her breath hitched, though she tried to mask it with a toss of her hair. "Then there are the withdrawals," I said, tapping the folder. 310,000 siphoned off, lining your offshore account, and Cassian Holt's arm with jewels. Her bag slipped slightly from her shoulder. She caught it with shaking fingers. "And now the syringe," I said softly. "Potassium chloride with insulin." The lab confirmed it. "You walked into his room planning to end him, and a nurse stopped you." "This isn't suspicion anymore, Celine. This is proof." Her face blanched. For a moment I thought she might run, but then her lips curled into a sneer. "You're old," she spat. "You mutter prayers to beads in hallways. No one will believe you over me. Not the doctors, not the courts. You're nothing but a senile widow clinging to her crippled son." I didn't flinch. I had been insulted before, dismissed before, underestimated before. Age had only sharpened my steel. I met her glare and replied, my voice low and cold. 30 years teaching taught me one thing: documents never lie. And I have them all. For the first time, she trembled. Her bravado cracked like porcelain under strain. She tried to recover, forcing another laugh, but it sounded hollow. "So, what, you'll wave papers around? You think anyone cares when he's already as good as dead?" I stepped closer, until only a breath separated us. "He's not dead. And every paper you forged, every dollar you stole, every lie you wrapped yourself in, I'll put it before the people who do care. Judges, investigators, federal prosecutors, and you'll have nothing left but shadows in garages like this one." Her jaw tightened, fury flashing in her eyes. For a heartbeat, I thought she might strike me, but she only clutched her bag tighter, her knuckles white. "You'll regret crossing me," she hissed. "No," I said evenly, holding her gaze. "You'll regret underestimating me." We stood locked in silence, the hum of the lights above, and the distant echo of a closing door the only sounds between us. Then she turned sharply, her heels scraping against the cement, and disappeared into the darkened rows of cars. I exhaled slowly, my hand tightening on the folder at my side. She knew I had the proof. She knew her mask was slipping. And I knew the moment was coming when evidence would no longer be enough, when Celine would either lash out or crumble under the weight of her own schemes. The hospital lobby was louder than usual, the next morning voices overlapping with the shrill ring of telephones. When I pushed through the doors, I saw why every screen mounted on the walls was tuned to Channel 9. Their bright graphics shouted across the space, "Socialite wife caught in murder for insurance plot." The segment rolled footage of Celine in her red silk dress on the yacht, Cassian Holt at her side, the timestamp blazing across the bottom corner. A reporter's voice cut through the images. Hospital insiders allege Celine Pierce, wife of critically injured Dorian Hightower, attempted to profit from his death by filing forged medical documents and making repeated calls to insurance companies about his $2.3 million life policy. I stopped dead in my tracks, my hand clutching the rosary in my coat pocket. To see it spoken aloud, no longer a secret, whispered in hallways, but broadcast across Los Angeles, was both vindication and dread. The camera cut to Dr. Hammond, the board chairwoman, her expression grave. Until investigations conclude, Celine Pierce has been formally suspended from any access to her husband's medical decisions. The words hit me like balm on a wound. For the first time in weeks, I felt the steel band around my chest loosen. Celine's grip was broken. Yet even as relief washed over me, the reporter's voice sharpened. Cassian Holt, cosmetic clinic manager and companion of Mrs. Pierce, could not be reached for comment. Sources say Holt has vacated his apartment and is believed to have left the city. So he had fled, leaving her to face the fallout alone. I pictured his smug smile on the yacht, replaced now by the pale face of a man who'd abandoned ship at the first crack in the hull. The segment ended with clips of Celine herself, pulled from society events, smiling before cameras, jewels flashing, the darling of charity galas. The anchor's voice cut through with finality. Her social media accounts have been deleted, her phone disconnected, and questions remain about the missing funds linked to offshore accounts. For now, outrage grows as the public asks, how could a wife betray a husband this way? When the program ended, the lobby erupted. Strangers shook their heads, some muttering curses under their breath. Reporters had already gathered outside the hospital doors, microphones clutched in eager hands, waiting for the next glimpse of Celine. I walked through the throng unnoticed for once and felt the shift in the air. The tide had turned. She was no longer untouchable, no longer gilded in charm. She was exposed, cornered, stripped of her illusions. But I knew Celine well enough to understand one truth. Cornered animals don't always flee. Sometimes they bare their teeth. As I reached the elevator, the weight of the folder in my bag reminded me that this was far from over. The court of public opinion was brutal, but the court of law was where her true reckoning would come, and I would be ready to face her there. The courthouse smelled of varnish and history, a place where truth was meant to be carved into stone. I sat at the petitioner's table, Lucienne's small hand tucked into mine, her wide eyes darting between the rows of strangers filling the gallery. My attorney, Colleen Drayton, leaned close and whispered, "We have the evidence, Marcella. Just breathe." Across the aisle, Celine sat rigid, her dark hair swept into a severe bun, makeup heavy enough to hide the cracks forming in her composure. She had no Cassian beside her now, no polished smile for the cameras. Only her lawyer, a sharp-suited man who spoke more with his sighs than his arguments. The judge entered robes, swishing gavel, striking once. "This is an emergency custody hearing in the matter of Hightower versus Pierce. Mrs. Hightower seeks guardianship of her granddaughter, Lucienne Pierce, on grounds of endangerment and parental unfitness. Mrs. Pierce contests." Celine's attorney stood first, his words slick. "Your Honor, my client is the natural mother of this child. Allegations against her are speculative, fueled by grief and age-related paranoia. There is no cause to remove Lucienne from her mother's custody. I felt Lucienne's fingers tighten around mine. Colleen rose in reply, her voice clear, unwavering. Speculation ends where evidence begins. And we have evidence. She called Nurse Isabel Marquez to the stand first. Isabel adjusted her badge hands steady as she spoke. I saw the DNR order filed under Dorian Hightower's name. The signature was not his, and hospital policy requires 2 physicians' signatures. There was only one. The courtroom stirred. Celine's attorney objected, but the judge overruled. Next came Nurse Drusilla Vaughn. Her voice cracked only once as she recounted the night Celine entered the ICU with an unmarked syringe. I intercepted her. The syringe contained potassium chloride mixed with insulin. Fatal if administered. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Lucienne pressed her face against my arm as though she sensed the danger that had hovered so close. Jonas Calloway, the private investigator, testified next. He displayed bank records, yacht receipts, transfers to a Cayman account. The withdrawals from Dorian's accounts matched Celine Pierce's expenditures exactly. Jewelry, luxury travel, offshore deposits, over $300,000 siphoned in 6 months. Finally, Dr. Kim, the forensic accountant Colleen had retained, walked the court through the numbers like a professor lecturing on theft. Her charts and spreadsheets painted a picture of steady, systematic fraud. The last witness was Special Agent Maura Delgado of the FBI. Her presence filled the room with authority. She laid out the facts in a voice that brooked no argument. Repeated insurance calls, forged medical documents, offshore laundering conspiracy to commit fraud. In my professional opinion, Mrs. Pierce's actions demonstrate intent to profit from her husband's death, she concluded. Celine's face drained of color, then flushed with fury. She whispered urgently to her attorney, who could only shake his head. The evidence was a tidal wave, and he was armed with nothing but a teacup. When it was time for closing arguments, Colleen's words carried the weight of every sleepless night I'd endured. Your Honor, this case is not about speculation. It is about a mother who placed money above life, and a grandmother who refuses to let her granddaughter be raised in the shadow of that greed. Lucienne deserves safety. She deserves truth. The judge's gavel struck again. Guardianship of Lucienne Pierce is hereby granted to Marcella Hightower, effective immediately. Mrs. Pierce, your parental rights are suspended pending the outcome of ongoing criminal investigations. Celine let out a strangled cry, stumbling to her feet. No, you can't take her from me. Her scream echoed against the walls as bailiffs steadied her arms. Lucienne clung to me, her tears soaking my sleeve. I held her close, whispering into her hair, "You're safe now, my star. You're safe." And as the gavel echoed one last time, I knew the battle for custody was won, but the war for justice had only just begun. 2 days after the custody ruling, my phone buzzed just as I was settling Lucienne into bed. She had fallen asleep, clutching the stuffed rabbit Dorian had given her when she was 3, her small body curled like a comma against the blanket. I stepped into the hall before answering. "Mrs. Hightower." The voice was clipped, official. "This is Agent Maura Delgado. We thought you'd want to know Celine's been taken into custody." I gripped the banister to steady myself. "Where Los Angeles International? International Terminal." She tried to board a flight to Lisbon using a fake passport. $80,000 in cash stuffed in her carry-on. She didn't even bother to hide it well. My knees weakened. For weeks, Celine had been a shadow at the edge of every breath I took. Her threats, her manipulations, her cold smile. Now, she was cornered. What charges, I managed to ask? Delgado's voice sharpened. Fraud. Conspiracy. Attempted murder. The evidence you and your team provided sealed it. She'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. I thanked her and hung up. pressing the phone against my chest. The house felt suddenly lighter, as though a storm had passed through and finally blown itself out. By morning, the news cycle devoured the story whole. Widow before his death. One headline blared, socialite wife accused of poison plot. Another screamed across a glossy tabloid cover. Footage from LAX showed Celine in her tailored coat wrists, bound in handcuffs, her face pale beneath the camera's glare. Reporters hounded every angle, the yacht parties, the forged DNR, the syringe in the ICU. Strangers who had once toasted Celine at charity galas now spat her name with venom. She had gone from darling to pariah in the span of a broadcast. I sat by Dorian's bedside that afternoon, the television muted in the corner, his monitors beating their steady rhythm. I told him everything. How the court had given me guardianship of Lucienne. How Celine had been caught with cash and a passport not her own. How the world finally saw her for what she was. His hand was still beneath mine, warm but unmoving. For the first time, I felt the quiet weight of relief. Not victory, never that, but the sense that the immediate danger had passed. My son could breathe without a viper poised over his bed. I bent close, whispering into his ear. She can't hurt you anymore. Or Lucienne. It's over now. But even as the words left me, I knew over was a fragile promise. Healing was not guaranteed by handcuffs or headlines. My son still lay silent, his future balanced on the flicker of brain activity that pulsed across the monitor screen. Justice had trapped Celine, but justice could not mend his broken body. I threaded my rosary beads through my fingers, grounding myself in prayer. Relief filled me, yes, but beneath it was another question, heavier than all the rest. Could he return? Could the man who had once carried Lucienne on his shoulders, who had debated novels with me across the dinner table, who had loved so fiercely, could he come back to us? The steady rhythm of the machines offered no answer. They only carried on indifferent, patient, a reminder that life clung to him still. I closed my eyes, resting my forehead against his hand. Celine was gone from our lives. Her schemes exposed her laughter, silenced by iron bars. But the greatest battle was not hers anymore. It was Dorian's. And I prayed with everything left in me that he was still fighting to return. Months passed in measured rhythms, the rise and fall of Dorian's chest, the soft beeps of monitors, the quiet routines of rehabilitation. Each day I sat at his bedside, with Lucienne reading aloud from his favorite books, whispering stories of family and home. And then, one spring morning, a miracle came. His fingers twitched beneath mine. At first, I thought I had imagined it. But then his eyelids fluttered, struggling against the weight of months. Mom. His voice was barely a rasp, but it was him, my son reaching back to us. Tears blurred my vision. Yes, Dorian, I'm here. We're all here. The weeks that followed were slow, filled with therapy sessions and fragile victories. He learned to speak again, to sit upright, to walk unsteadily down the hall, with Lucienne cheering at his side. Each step was a triumph. Each smile a gift I had feared we would never see again. The day he finally returned home, sunlight poured through the living room as though the world itself celebrated. Lucienne burst into his arms, nearly knocking him over with her embrace. "Daddy, Grandpa's pancakes are better than yours," she shouted, her laughter ringing like bells. Dorian looked at me over her shoulder, his eyes filled with both gratitude and grief. "You kept her safe," he said softly. "You kept us both safe." I could only nod, swallowing the ache in my throat. Some wounds never fully closed, but healing didn't always mean erasing scars. It meant carrying them forward with strength. Life resumed in small, precious ways. Saturday mornings became pancake mornings again. Lucienne insisted on helping, spilling flour across the counter, while Dorian steadied her small hands. Evenings brought quiet walks through the garden, his steps slow, but determined her chatter. filling the silence he once occupied with silence of his own. And I found myself at my window one afternoon arranging roses I had clipped from the garden into old glass jars. Their petals caught the sunlight, turning the room into a kaleidoscope of reds and pinks. It reminded me that beauty can bloom even after storms if only one is patient enough to nurture it. As I pressed the last stem into place, I whispered words that had carried me through the darkest nights. Love may open doors, but only respect keeps them open. For too long, Celine had mistaken love for a resource to exploit a door to force open for her own gain. She had no respect for the life she tried to destroy. But here, in this quiet room, filled with roses and light respect, was what endured. Respect for life, for family, for truth. I stepped back, watching Lucienne tug Dorian into the kitchen, her laughter trailing like a ribbon behind them. My son was alive. My granddaughter was safe. And I, though weathered by battle, had kept my promise. The roses at my window swayed gently in the breeze, their petals unfolding toward the sun. And in that fragile, fragrant moment, I felt peace return to our home at last.